In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So, when you go to apply for jobs these days, what's one of the things you most commonly run into in the application process? People are always looking for, veterans. By what you mean by veterans? Experience. They're always looking for experience. Why? Why is experience a good thing to have? Because something comes with experience. What comes with experience? Knowledge. Okay, definitely knowledge comes with experience. But knowledge that is applied is wisdom. Applied knowledge is wisdom. Many people know a lot of things, but a lot of times we don't apply what we know. Wisdom is taking what we know and then applying it forward and making an action. And so when we look for jobs, and they're like, well, we want 3 or 4 years of experience or whatever the situation may be, what they're looking for is somebody who has experience because they're looking for a certain amount of wisdom to come from that. And that wisdom, they're hoping when they hire this person, this individual, this new employee, will apply that wisdom and make certain decisions within the company and for the bettering of the company. Is there any way to get that experience without going through the steps? There's no way you're going to jump from a new grad to 5 years experience without going through the 5 years. And then when you finally get that new job that is looking for the first 5 years that you had, what are you doing? You're looking back, when you get into new situations at the new job, you're looking back and saying, hey, I've seen this before, I've dealt with this before, and from what I've learned in the history, I'm now going to start to make new decisions. So one of the key parts of living with wisdom is to look at history. One of the key ways of living with wisdom and applying wisdom is to look at your experience, and experience is another way of saying is to look at your history, is to look back and say, hey, I've seen this situation before, or I've seen this circumstance, I've seen people react in this way before, and therefore, from what I've experienced, I'm going to now do something different. When our Lord was in today's gospel, He was talking to the Pharisees. And as He was talking to the Pharisees, some people heard what John the Baptist was saying and they received it. But it says that the Pharisees and the Lord rejected the will of God. They rejected the will of God. And the Lord looked at them and finally said, to what am I going to call this generation? What do I say about this generation who, over time, repeatedly have rejected the will of God? They rejected the prophets, and now John the Baptist came. They rejected John the Baptist, and now they're rejecting Christ. So history is repeating itself. And so He looked at them, He's like, well, what do I call them? Call them like children sitting in the marketplace, calling to one another, saying, we played the flute for you, but you didn't dance. We mourned to you, and you didn't weep. We tried to have a relationship. We did it over and over and over, all throughout the Old Testament, but you couldn't hear. You couldn't listen. You couldn't open up your heart. So, looking back at our history is important. Looking back at where we came from is important. Because it helps us get to the future, or the present, and be able to look at the future, and to be able to approach it with a certain degree of wisdom. And that's why I want to, as we start our membership course today, we're going to start off with the history of this community. Because how this community came to be is going to affect how we deal with ourselves in the present and how we look at the future. It's applied wisdom. It's applied knowledge. We look back, we look at it. What are the lessons? But lessons are only good if you apply them. And that's where wisdom comes in. Our Lord looked at the Old Testament multiple times in talking with the Pharisees. He's like, I sent you all these prophets. You guys didn't listen. So, we're going to take today and we're going to look at our history. But history, it's important for us as a community. But history on a very personal level holds the key to many of the questions we have in our own lives. Looking back at our own personal histories holds many of the keys to our own lives and to the questions that we have, to understanding who we are and why we do the things that we do. But we've heard that. Is this the first time you've heard somebody say that there are valuable lessons in history? You can just nod. Am I the first person to ever tell you that there are valuable lessons in history? No. Everybody here is, like, if you saw it from my perspective, it's like, no, I've heard this. My history teacher told me that. All right? So, history is important. But being intentional about looking at your history is another thing. That's taking what you've heard, knowledge, gained knowledge, and actually applying it. That's wisdom. And the gospel of today ends saying, wisdom is justified by her children. Wisdom is justified by her children. How do you know that wisdom is actually legitimate? It bears fruits. It bears a corrective path. It bears a change in the way that you do things. And so, as we get started here with our membership course, we're going to take a look at our history. But that's for us. Still, the biggest challenge is for you to say, in the questions that you have personally, can you look back at your own history, at your own upbringing, at your own family, and say, hey, wait a second, I see a pattern. And then apply a change. Wisdom is justified by her children. And her children are a corrective action, or an intentional way of living, or deciding that this is what I've learned, this is the pattern that I've seen, but I'm going to do something else, and I'm not going to be held a victim to the past. So in our minute of silence, I want us to meditate on the value of history, on the value of looking back, at the experiences that you've had. Because there is a lot to be learned from looking back. And there's a lot to be gained from looking back in order to set a new course for the future. Glory be to God forever.